everyone, it's Lisa here. In this two-part tutorial, we'll start by exploring all the brushes included in the Playful Pencil set, plus I'll show you how to use the fur brushes and include a few helpful tips along the way. Then we'll dive into creating an adorable bear illustration using a variety of the brushes from the set. Before we get started, I recommend importing the tutorial swatches included in your download. You'll find those in the swatches folder. You'll also want to import the tutorial illustration called Pajama Bear, which is located in the Creative Warm-Up Illustrations folder. So go ahead and pop that into your Procreate gallery so it's ready to go. Although I'll be covering a fair amount in this video, I highly recommend taking a moment to read through the super duper resource guide that comes free with the set. It gives you a more in-depth explanation of how the overlay full brush works, plus loads of other handy tips and techniques I use to create the illustrations you see in the product page. There's also a step-by-step guide on how to use the fur brushes, which you can refer back to anytime you need a refresher. Okay, great, so let's dive into the brush overview. Once you've imported and opened the brush set, you'll notice that the brushes are organized into sections with a brief overview of their intended use. You'll also find some useful info and tips for each of the brushes in the free guide included. So let's begin at the top with the essentials. These include two lovely versatile pencils. These are great for sketching and for final line work. The Playful Pencil is a wonderful cheeky pencil that works well for accents and grungy details. I used it quite a bit in the elephant illustration, which gives it a lovely rough scribbly feel in places. The fuzzy pencil is great for producing fuzzy edges that have a bit of a grain, and it works really well with the grainy filler brushes. The overlay brush is a brush I created for a very specific purpose. It's designed to be used over texture to create a beautiful cohesive finish. The blend mode for the brush is set to overlay, which interacts wonderfully when used above texture. So with overlay, it combines both multiply and screen, which means you'll get interesting results depending on the color you use. The more layers you add, the more you intensify the results. And I'm going to show you how to use it over texture a bit later on in this tutorial. And then finally, use the eraser brush as your eraser for a gritty, slightly translucent finish. So this is a really great brush if you're working with negative space style illustrations. The textured fillers are pretty self-explanatory. They are very handy for quickly filling large areas with interesting textures. You can change the direction of the grain in these brushes by rotating your canvas, and you can also double up on the textures by rotating your canvas and doing a second pass. The grainy fillers are great for soft, dreamy graphite illustrations. I mainly use them to create this cute little fox illustration. So to intensify the grain, you can either layer your strokes or rotate your canvas to change the direction of the grain and then intensify the shading area. The fur, fuzz and hair section has a variety of fur textures perfect for drawing cute animal characters. And I'm going to show you how to use them in a second when we illustrate the tail of a fox. So we'll come back to those. The linear shaders are time-saving brushes that quickly create quirky textures along the direction of your brush stroke. So these are really great for backgrounds and working around shapes, and the blend mode for the brushes are set to multiply or linear burn, which creates a lovely intensity as the texture overlaps. However, bear in mind, if you want to use a lighter color over a dark area on the same layer, you'll either have to create a new layer above that, or you can temporarily change the brush blend mode to normal. So to do that, tap on the brush to open the Brush Studio, then head over to Rendering and select Normal under Blend Mode, and then tap Done to confirm. In the textured marking section, you'll find some quirky fun brushes. I love using these brushes to create whimsical details here and there, or fill shapes for an interesting finish. Here I use the messy circular pencil shading brush as the base texture of her pants. Then I use the overlay fill brush to form a really rich textured finish. You'll find some more details on that in the guide. Let's move on to learning how to use the fur brushes. I've gone ahead and imported the illustration called Little Fox About Town. So for this demo, I'll just be working on the tail of the little guy, but of course you can go ahead and complete the entire fox body using the same technique I'll be showing you for the tail. I'll be using colors from the Playful Pencil color palette as my starting point. I have my illustration on a layer set to multiply, and I'm just going to bring that opacity down to about 40. And then I have a new layer underneath that, and that's going to be my new layer that I apply the texture to. And we're going to be using a mid to sort of dark tone brown as the first layer of texture. So choosing the soft wave fur brush, I'm going to apply my first layer of texture, and I'm going to make sure that I'm following the curve of the actual shape. So if we were doing the face, we'd be following the curve of the face. That's a great way to give it that authentic look. And this is all the fur brushes have lovely pressure sensitivity, so you can use the same stroke to create quite a wide variety of fur. So I'm starting at the base and then just stopping where the tip of the fox tail will be, because of course that tip is white, and you can decide how much texture you want to apply, but that to me is fine. I just want a sort of more of a uniform look. So creating a new layer underneath that, and I'm going to choose a light brown color really. And again, following the shape of our tail. So coming back to our original foxtail layer, I'm going to choose this very saturated orange and use the overlay brush. So overlay fill. And now we want to just test the opacity of that brush. So I'm just going once. It's quite intense. So I'm going to bring that down to about 70. And make sure that you are in fact working on the same layer as the texture, because the brush needs to interact with that texture. I'm just going to apply the brush with one application without lifting my pencil, because as mentioned, the more times you lift your pencil, the more it intensifies. And I just want a more uniform look for this. And then do the same with the lighter part of the tail, but this time I'm choosing white. So I'm just lightening that tail a dash. Let's turn off our illustration just to double check. So what I want to do now is just clean up those edges using the eraser. And I'm going to leave those extra little bits. I think that looks pretty good. So creating a new layer above that, I'm setting that to multiply because I want it to kind of mush and interact with my texture layer. And I'm making sure that that is a clipping mask and choosing a much more intense browny red color. I'm going to use the Intense Messy Fur brush. And this will be the shadow parts of the tail. So essentially where it's coming into the body area, and then underneath, I'm just lightly applying it, not too much. We don't want it over the top. So something like that, I think looks pretty good. And then maybe just bring that opacity down until I'm happy. Yep. And then a new layer above that, I'm choosing a much lighter color and using the soft Wavy Fur Sparse brush. Just here and there. And then much lighter still. So these are just accents here and there, giving you that illusion of highlights. And then finally we want to create a new layer above that and use, well, we probably need to pick from the tail. So I'm just going to select my brush first. So using the long soft fur sparse brush, and I'm going to turn off my fox illustration. I'm going to select a color from the actual image, probably that. And then, so these are our little flyaway bits. So you want to be quite sparingly with the brush. And then where those two areas meet, we want to blend that. And of course you can decide how much you want to add, but I think that's almost there for me. Yeah, I think that looks good. So as mentioned, you can go ahead and finish the entire illustration using that same technique I've just shown you for the tail on the rest of his body. Okay, so now we're going to move on to creating our cute little bear. I've already imported my little bear illustration, and we'll be using the palette called Pajama Bear. And I'm going to just turn down that opacity of my illustration and then set that to multiply. Oh, I just wanted to tell you up front the canvas size that I'm using. So this is very similar to most of the canvas sizes that I use, which is 39,000 by 4950. I find that's like a good in-between size, not too big, not too small. And it gives me the freedom to use my illustrations in quite a wide variety of applications. Okay, so on a new layer, before I do that, I just want to rename that so we don't get confused and move that right above everything. Okay, so on a new layer, we're just going to create a block out of our little bear first. And I'm just going to use the graphite pencil for that and just simply trace over our drawing. And I'm doing this because I need a block out shape over our background, because our background is going to be quite textured. So I just need a nice shape just to give me a better foundation for my little bear. So it's just the edges that I need to be rough. So if the edges are peeking through, they still have that textured look to them. That's why I'm using a pencil and not just a smooth brush. So I'm just going to drag and drop to fill that shape. It looks pretty good. Okay, on a new layer below that, I'm going to start working on my background and sticking to that dark color that we've been using. I'm going to use one of the linear shaders, and the idea is to create some lovely textured interest in your background. So you can vary the size of the brush, but I'm essentially following the shape of the bear and also the oval shape. So these linear brushes are great for doing that. And you can decide how much intensity you want. And because we want to add some quirky details, I'm going to use different brushes here and there just for some interest. There really are no rules when it comes to this, so feel free to experiment and have fun. I'm even moving on to the long loops. Let's see what that looks like. And just here and there. So I'm rotating my canvas because I want to be able to control the direction of these loops. And you can have fun experimenting with these brushes. I think this is a really nice way to add quirky sort of details to your work. I think I'm going to stop there, and now we're going to use our overlay brush. So I'm sticking to that same color, and I've selected the overlay, and like we did before, I'm just testing the opacity. I think that's too mild, so I'm going to take it to full opacity. Yeah, I think that's a bit better. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to make sure that I can see the entire illustration, making sure I'm still working on the background layer, and I want to be able to complete it in one pass. And if you make any mistakes on the edges, that's not a problem. You can always clean that up. And take your time if you need to. But you'll see it's starting to react in places here and there in a different way, and intensifying those textures here and there, which is really nice. I'm going to turn my illustration off to have a look at what we're looking like. I think that looks really nice. I'm going to continue. So using the lighter color, and now I might just bring that opacity down. So don't be afraid to experiment with that. And my overall illustration, I'm visualizing the light coming from this direction. So shadow is generally going to be this side. So I might think about intensifying this side of my illustration. And if you can recall, the more times we go over with the overlay brush, the more it intensifies areas. So you just want to be mindful of that, and if you're a bit concerned, you can always bring the opacity down of the brush. And I'm going to swap over to the blue for a bit of color variation. And it's really subtle, but it does make a difference. You see it's starting to interact there and bring out that blue, which is really nice. But just be mindful, the more you go over an area, the more it will intensify. So now we have a nice variation in color and the texture is looking really interesting. So I'm going to move on to my little bear's body and making sure I'm on a new layer above that block out layer. I'm going to choose white and one of the grain brushes, the uniform noise brush, and just testing my size, probably bring it up to about there. I'm just laying the foundation down of the first round. And then, oops, a little too small. Just made the brush slightly smaller so I can have more control over these smaller areas. I'm still leaving a little bit of a gap here to indicate the difference between the face and the neck. And I'm just hopping between turning the illustration on and off. This is a good way to make sure that you're on the right track and just checking your work as you go. So now we're going to use the, turning that up, and now we're going to use the brush to go over this area to create light from this side. So essentially we're doubling up on that texture. And I'm just rotating my canvas just to change the direction of that grain, so this helps to intensify that. I'm essentially using that additional layer to give the illusion of a lighter part of his face. Turning off my sketch to see where I'm at. So you'll see we're really starting to create some form just by adding that additional texture. And then finally I'm going to use one of the furry brushes on the edges. So the soft long hair fur, well, soft long hair, and just on the edge here and there to create some fuzz, which I think looks pretty cute. Okay, so let's move on to just adding some features quickly. So I've created a new layer above that and set that to multiply, turning my sketch back on, and I'm choosing that dark color and just using the graphite pencil, and we just want to add some features. You can decide on his expression if you want to change that, and his little nose, scribbly little filling. And then maybe the bunny's features as well while we're here. And then the buttons as well. I'm just going to add those in. Okay, so moving on to his little onesie. I'm making sure that I'm working underneath that layer, the feature layer that we just created. In fact, I'm going to name it so I don't get confused. So creating a layer above that, I want to start working on his onesie. So choosing this blue color, I'm going to use one of the textured marking brushes, the messy circular pencil shading. And again, just testing the size first. I think I wanted a dash bigger. Yeah, I think that looks good. So this is a nice way to quickly add some scribbly markings without much effort. Just bringing down the size when I'm working in a smaller area. And as before, you can decide how much of this texture you want to apply. I am going to be using the overlay full brush on top of this just to create a more uniform look. But maybe you like leaving it just like that, which I also think looks really nice. Let's turn our illustration off, have a look. It's pretty cute. Okay, so using that overlay fill again, I'm sticking to the same color and I'm going to test the opacity. Maybe a dash more. I'm on 68, so let's have a look. Maybe we want more texture, so I'm going to bring the texture down, the opacity down, because we definitely still want to see that texture, but I just want to create a little bit more of a smoother, cohesive finish. And as before, if you are worried about the edges, don't be worried. You can always go back and clean up. And now I just want to use the eraser tool just to give myself a bit more of a definition in his arms. So I'm still on that same layer. Just lightly, I've used the eraser. Maybe you want to add some little crease details. Yeah, I'm happy with that. I'm going to move on to the pink areas of his onesie. So on a new layer and choosing the scribble texture brush. So this will be for his little collar. And you'll see just by leaving small gaps between sections, you're creating the definition of those sections without using line work as such. And of course, there's nothing wrong with line work. I use it in my artwork all the time, but this makes for an interesting, different look. Okay, I'm going to check my work. I think he's coming on. And then as a final little touch on his onesie, I'm going to use that Playful pencil to create little scribbly marks. So almost like a little stripe design. This is a really lovely pencil for creating interesting scribbly lines. I think I like this style a lot because it's very forgiving and it allows you to really let loose and have fun. So yeah, if you're used to creating more controlled, refined work, this is a nice exercise to just give it a try and see where it takes you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to his little hat and putting my illustration back on. I'm still going to use the pink and come down to our dense line texture brush. And it's important to rotate your canvas to control the direction of those lines. So I'm just testing the size. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So you can create some lovely texture variation in the actual shapes by just varying your pressure of your pencil. And what I'm trying to do is sort of follow the line of the shape of the little hat. And then I'm going to set that to screen or color dodge maybe even overlay. Let's set that to overlay. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our little bunny. And you could use the same layer as the bear, but I like having everything on separate layers just in case. And I'm going to use the soft short hair brush. And as before, I'm following the curve of the shape of our little bunny. So this is quite important if you want to make it look a little bit more authentic in terms of the fur is actually following our little bunny's shape and his body. So I'm just going over areas that I want to intensify. And then what I want to do is use a different brush for his tail. You can use the long spiky hair brush. Just checking the size. Let's maybe use the other one. Yeah, I think I like that one. So I'm using this soft long hair brush. And I'm just creating a round action with my pencil to create that shape. And then we just want to, here and there, use the eraser to form those shapes better. Making sure I've got the right eraser, yeah. And it needs to be quite small. So we're just helping the viewer form these shapes in their mind's eye a bit better, because there's a lot of fur and it might not be too clear. So I'm just helping that along. Let's have a look. And I'm continuously checking. And you could, if you want a more harder edge, you could use one of the pencils as your eraser. If you want a softer edge, you could use one of the grainy brushes. But I'm pretty happy with this. And if you find that you've gone too far, like I feel like I have in places, you can always come back and use your brush again, just to soften that. I think Bunny's taking shape. Okay, so let's quickly add some cheeks. So we need to be working above that. And I'm going to use that same pink color. And let's use the dense scribble brush. And I just want to check the size. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. In fact, I might want to actually show more definition. So gone slightly larger. And then we need it much smaller for our little bunny. Okay, so now I'm going to start adding some shadow work. So on a new layer above everything, I'm going to set that to multiply. And I'm going to start with this sort of secondary brown color using one of the grain brushes, the Uniform Noise grain. And I just want to check the size as always. In fact, I'm going to use this graphite grain because I want it to be quite grainy. And I'm thinking about where things would be in shadow. Just very loosely. But it really helps to define things when you add this layer. Kind of working around the little bunny as well, just to highlight that. We could even swap to one of the more blue colors and see what that does. I like experimenting with different shades for my shadow because it really does make a difference. And as before, if you feel like you've gone too far, you can always erase an area. So I'm just going to bring the size down of my brush and work in these areas that need a little bit more sort of detail. And the same for my hat, but I just need my sketch back on. So my aim here is to create definition in those folds and just to help the viewer get an idea of the shape of this little floppy bit a bit better. And then just swapping over to the uniform grain. I wanted a smoother sort of look here. Let's turn our illustration off. Yeah, looking pretty good. I want to just lighten this area a dash. I think it needs it, so I'm going to create a new layer above my blockout layer, and let's choose that color. So this is just an experiment, and we're going to see where it takes us. I'm just going to apply some texture. So I'm using the spiky hatch, and I'm thinking about, again, the light hitting this little cap. And we're going to clip this in a second. Yeah, I think that already looks a lot better. So that's giving more definition, especially to the top of the hat, which is what I'm going for. And I might even add a dash more of a lighter color. Still using that same brush. So I think that really helps bring that area a bit to life. And now I want to add some quirky details to my background. So making sure I'm working above that. So I'm right at the bottom, but I've made a layer above my background layer. And I'm going to use white. And this is where you can honestly have fun. There is no right or wrong. Experiment, play with the brushes, see where it takes you. So I'm using the Playful Pencil. And there really is no right and wrong here. This is entirely personal taste and preference, but I quite like creating like scribbly bits and interesting markings. So kind of a tree forming there. This is where you really, there's, as I said, no right and wrong. This is just having fun and experimenting and winging it, essentially. I love the scratchiness of this pencil. Yeah, so I could really get carried away. So I might just stop there. Maybe I'll use just one more brush. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Okay, so I love that as it is, but I'm going to show you one more trick that I love experimenting with in Procreate. And that's using the gradient map feature. So I'm going to take 3 fingers, swipe down and copy all. And then making sure that I paste it right above everything. So 3 fingers again and paste. And then you'll notice that Procreate creates almost like a saturated version of that if you copy and paste in the same document. I don't mind that. You might have an issue with that. If you do, then you need to just export it first and then bring it back in. But I'm going to leave that as it is. And then coming over to adjustments and then choosing gradient map, I'm going to create a new gradient. So hitting plus at the top there, and then coming over to our swatches that we were using earlier, you'll see there's 4 over here. These are for the gradient map that I want you to experiment with, but of course feel free to choose any color, but these are a nice starting point. So I'm just going to tap on that, and then to add a new color each time, you just tap once and then tap again to choose your color. And so now what we can do is experiment with where you want this color to fit. So the gradient map works with the values of your drawing. And then of course we want to bring that gradient down by just sliding our pencil until you're kind of happy where you want it to sit. I think that's looking pretty interesting. So this gives it more of a sepia look, which I really like. So let's have a look at what it looks like without. So that's without it, and then that's with it. So you'll see that creates quite an interesting finish. And what you could even do is go kind of crazy, I guess, and maybe even choose for your darker tone, you could choose like a blue color. That also gives quite interesting results. Honestly, I could spend hours experimenting like this, but I won't. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that, so I'm going to just hit anywhere on my screen to accept that. And then what we want to do is another final test step that you could do is just change the saturation. Maybe you want to bring it up a dash, maybe you want it slightly brighter. And then let's have a look at with and without. So that's with the gradient map, and then that's without. So I like them both, but I think this is quite a nice variation of the same artwork, and it's also really nice to experiment with these features in Procreate. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it showed you how to use the brushes in the Playful Pencil and how to have fun with some of the features in Procreate. Thanks for watching and happy creating!